Morant with a running start. It dunks! Oh my goodness! Tie game in overtime. Gasol will turn his heat. It's gone! Memphis on top. 7-10 remaining. Conley now with three. Count it! A 15-point lead for Memphis. And Blake Griffin gets into it on the floor with Randolph. Hard to tell if there are any punches being thrown under there, but Griffin took acceptance. Adams going long. Morant! He hit it! John Morant, insanity!
You gotta be kidding me.
Welcome to Grits and Grinds, a Memphis Grizzlies podcast. My name is Keith Parrish. On today's episode, I'm going to give a grade for the Grizzlies offseason. Plus, I'm going to go over a little bit of Grizzlies news. Before we get there, just an announcement. If you want to play fantasy football with me, well, that is available to my Patreon supporters, and our signups are open. Right now, the draft is going to be at the end of the month on Thursday, August 29th. So if you join my Patreon at patreon.com/fastbreakbreakfast for $5 a month, you can play fantasy football. You can also play fantasy basketball with me when the time comes. Also, if you join the Patreon, you get a bonus episode every month, and you can join the Slack channel. So if you want to support the creation of this show, why not join now and play fantasy football with me and other listeners? Patreon.com/fastbreakbreakfast. All right, let's wrap up a little bit of Olympics coverage as far as it pertains to the Grizzlies, and then we'll get into the off-season grade. In the Olympics, I assume you guys have been watching it. Team USA had an unbelievable game against Serbia. Serbia did have former Grizzlies player Marko Guduric, who had a big impact on that game, but that was an all-time Olympics basketball game. Regardless of the country, it was a very impressive and exciting game as LeBron and Steph and KD and Joel Embiid all came through huge to beat Nikola Jokic and Serbia. There's also been some other, of course, Grizzlies adjacent players and actual Grizzlies players who have been performing in the Olympics. To put a bow on that, Santi Aldama, of course, was eliminated as Spain lost their final group play game to Canada. It was a close game. Came down to the wire. Santi had his worst scoring game of the competition. He only had 7 points. He missed all 4 of his 3-point attempts, so he was 2 for 8 overall from the field. He did have 11 rebounds and 4 assists. Overall, a strong performance from Santi in the Olympics, but a disappointing final performance in what was essentially a knockout game for him and Spain. Now, Exhibit 10 signing Yuki Kawamura. His Olympics also came to an end as Japan didn't advance past the group play. In their final game, Kawamura once again had some bold stats. 21 points and 10 assists in his final game. I didn't watch this one, but it's another huge statistical performance. His efficiency all tournament, not the best. In the game against Brazil, he was just 7 out of 19 from the field, but only had 2 turnovers against 10 assists, so that's impressive. Also, Japan's team, of course, had 2-time Grizzlies player Yuta Watanabe playing. Yuta was only 6 out of 17 in that final Japan loss. As far as Team USA and their advancing to play France in the gold medal game, I don't know if you saw it, but they also played former Grizzlies player Bruno Caboclo in the quarterfinals. Bruno Caboclo is Brazil's center. He scored 30 points against Team USA. I mean, yeah, it was a blowout loss, but Bruno's been impressive in the Olympics. He also scored 30 points, or I think 33 points in Brazil's game right before the Team USA matchup. So he's just a unique player, finally found his niche as an overseas center. Maybe at some point an NBA team would try to get him over here for an end-of-bench guy. I don't know if the money would make sense for him to leave his current situation playing in Europe, but he's still only 28, and he was very good in this Olympics. And I guess that's probably everything for the Olympics to wrap up. As far as other Grizzlies news, other NBA news, Shams Charania leaked the Christmas Day matchups. The Grizzlies were not included. they're still in the ascendancy as far as getting back into the national consciousness, I feel like. I mean, they did have a lot of national TV games last year scheduled for once Ja Morant's suspension was over, but then once Ja Morant got injured and out for the season, they lost a lot of those national TV games. By the way, the schedule is supposed to come out the end of next week. That will be something for us to talk about then. Looking at the Grizzlies and how they're viewed right now as far as the current league-wide landscape and the Western Conference landscape, the Grizzlies win total as far as their over-under projections at sportsbooks, right now they're at 47.5 wins. That's slightly up. I feel like they were mainly at 46.5 wins a few weeks ago. They have the 5th highest win total projection as far as over-unders in the Western Conference. Right now, the Timberwolves, Thunder, Nuggets, and Mavericks currently have higher win total projections. The Grizzlies are tied right now with the Suns. The Suns number also has gone up recently. I think that's directly tied to Tyus Jones joining that team. The Suns and Grizzlies now both ahead of the Kings and Pelicans when it comes to those win total over-under projection numbers coming out of the casinos or out of the sports books. The Grizzlies, however, have the 8th best odds right now to win the Western Conference. So their odds to win the Western Conference are much lower than their win total projections. But that a lot of that is just, I think it's two things. It's the size of the market. If the Grizzlies were a bigger market team, there'd be more people betting on them, and thus the number would go up as the sports books try to balance the money on each side of the line. Like the Lakers have a much lower over-under win total number right now than the Grizzlies, but their odds to win the West are higher. Some of that, size of the market, huge fan base with the Lakers, but also some of it is the fact that most people feel like the Lakers are more equipped in the playoffs maybe than the Grizzlies are because of LeBron James. I mean, we saw it in the Olympics. LeBron James is amazing. And having LeBron and AD, perhaps they are better built for the playoffs. But another reason that the Grizzlies, I think, are not as high on the list of teams favored to win the Western Conference is some legitimate skepticism about the Grizzlies' postseason skills and the fact that they have struggled, actually, in the postseason. I think it is not a unwarranted criticism to look at the Grizzlies and say, hey, with Ja Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr. and Taylor Jenkins, they've won one playoff series. And, you know, you think about the injury issues in 2023, you say maybe it's not fair to say, well, yeah, we were the 2 seed, but we were hurt against the 7 seed Lakers. But remember, the Grizzlies were favored in that series, even with Steven Adams being out for the year, even with Brandon Clark being out for the year, going into that playoff series, even with the massive market of LA and that fan base and all the bettors betting on the Lakers, the Grizzlies were still favored in that series before it began. And so you look at the Grizzlies losing as the 2 seed against the Lakers. You look at the previous year where their one playoff series victory against the Timberwolves, when again, they were the 2 seed and the Timberwolves were the 7 seed. It was a nerve-wracking affair. So I think those are all legitimate criticisms. Like that Timberwolves series, remember, it was the first time any team had ever come back from double-digit fourth quarter leads 3 times in the same series. You commend the Grizzlies for those comebacks, but also, why were you trailing by double digits in so many of those games when you were the 2 seed and you were playing a 7 seed Timberwolves team that also had very little playoff experience at that point? So those are, I think, reasonable reasons to doubt the Grizzlies, or why the Grizzlies are not favored, let's say, to win the West, or they have the 8th best odds right now to win the West. And all that kind of leads into my offseason feeling for the Grizzlies. Like ever since that 2023 postseason, the front office has been focused on, we have to improve our playoff performance. We have to improve our half-court offense. We have to improve our shooting. And that is still kind of an unresolved thing. We hope we addressed it, but like we hoped that drafting David Roddy would help it. We hope that drafting Jake LaRavia would help it. This year, we hope that drafting Cam Spencer and Jalen Wells will help it. We know keeping Luke Kennard, that should help it. But all these things are attempts to fix a problem that is known, and it's still unknown, in fact, whether or not those things have been addressed. And also addressing your issues through the draft is risky and unproven. And when I look at an offseason grade, one of the main things that I consider is what avenues did you use that were available to you to improve your team? Well, obviously the Grizzlies don't do great using that standard. I also look at how is this year's roster better or different than last year's roster. And when I look at last year's roster, I use the healthy version, the theoretical healthy version of last year's team. I don't know why I wouldn't use that standard. And another thing, when I'm comparing rosters from year to year, I don't really consider the players that are returning. I don't consider internal improvement. Like Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, and Jaren Jackson Jr. all could get better and maybe are expected to be better this year than last year. Their skills could still improve as they enter the primes of their careers. Gigi Jackson and Vince Williams Jr., I think, are going to be better this year compared to last year. That's why I'm optimistic about the Grizzlies. That's why I think the Grizzlies are going to be very good this season. But that doesn't weigh in at all for me on an offseason grade. Internal improvements are expected. That has nothing to do, to me, with the addition of talent to the squad. I'm talking about the changeover of players. That's how I grade the team. And so, based on that standard, I do not think this was a good offseason. I would call this an offseason not very good at all. I think the grade I would give would be like a D. I would call this offseason a D. What did they do? They used their draft picks. Fine. They drafted Zach Edey. They drafted Jalen Wells. They drafted Cam Spencer. They did not aggressively move up in the draft or anything. They used the draft picks where they were. I mean, I guess except for Cam Spencer. They moved up a few picks to get Cam Spencer, but they used their draft picks that they had. They kept Luke Kennard. They salary dumped Zaire Williams / traded him for Mamadi Diakite. That's it. That is a D offseason in my book. It is not the full apocalyptic doomsday scenario that I outlined before the offseason. The doomsday scenario, reminder, was they add 2 rookies to the main roster based on whoever they draft. They decline Luke Kennard option and let him walk and sign like a minimum guy for a center. That was doomsday. They didn't do it. But the one step up from doomsday was exactly what they did. Use 2 roster spots on rookies that you draft. Keep Luke Kennard on a lower salary. Dodge the tax. The end. So for me, that's not a good offseason. I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe if you push back against what I'm saying, like what kind of grade would you give a team for dodging the luxury tax? Like this was not a making a deft move where you actually somehow added talent or you picked up an asset and moved off a guy you didn't want to improve your team and also dodge the tax. No, they used one of their, I think, 6 available second rounders to get rid of Zaire Williams' contract. They reduced the number of playable NBA players. You can criticize Zaire Williams by saying he's not good or he hasn't achieved what we hoped, but he's a useful 10th, 11th, 12th man. He's not someone who doesn't belong in the NBA. He's someone who's going to be rostered, I believe, beyond this year. So you reduce the number of playable NBA players you have on your roster. Diakite, there's no evidence he's a playable NBA player. Jalen Wells, we hope, fingers crossed, is a playable NBA player, but he's the 39th pick. He's a rookie. We don't know. So you reduce the number of playable NBA players you had. You dodged the tax. You did not engage in free agency because of your salary tax concerns. There was an available roster spot. There still is one. The Mamadi Diakite spot that could have been used or can be used on picking up a free agent. There were lots of free agents available that could have helped the team, that you could have signed to a cheap contract, and those players would have then turned into an asset, both on the court or for future trades. If you signed Haywood Highsmith to the deal the Miami Heat kept him on, that's a good player to have for this roster specifically. You also could have traded him if you wanted to later. So for all those reasons, I'm not that high on the offseason. I'm high on the Grizzlies. Let's make the distinction. High on the Grizzlies, not high on the 2024 offseason. Also, let's look at the change of roster from last year to this year. Zach Edey and Jalen Wells are on the main roster. So is Mamadi Diakite. Those three players take the place of Yuta Watanabe, Lamar Stevens, and Zaire Williams. If you look at it just like that, you're like, oh, well, that's actually way better. Because I'm way more excited, of course, Zach Edey, the 9th pick. He's better than all those guys. Losing Yuta Watanabe, Lamar Stevens, and Zaire Williams, who cares? We needed to get rid of those players. But I don't think that's the proper context to look at it. I am not just looking at it like that because the only reason Lamar Stevens and Yuta Watanabe were on the team is because we traded things away because our season was going nowhere. We traded away David Roddy. We traded away Xavier Tillman. We traded away Steven Adams. I think the only standard to judge this team on is look at our healthy team from last year, and then I say is adding Jalen Wells and Zach Edey, is that better than having Steven Adams and Xavier Tillman and David Roddy and Zaire Williams? That's the comparison. I don't really think it is. I think if there's an argument to be made that the Grizzlies are better right now, it's that Vince Williams Jr. is a revelation. And Vince Williams Jr. as your 6th, 7th, 8th man is going to be better than what we had last year when we were still playing David Roddy and Zaire Williams. I think there's a hope that Zach Edey's offense will be better for the team than what Steven Adams projected. But asking Zach Edey to be better than what Steven Adams was in the 2022 season and in the 2023 season when he played, that's unreasonable. If you want to argue the fit could boost the lineups more just because of the offensive threat that Edey provides, okay, that's a fair argument. And I'm optimistic it might be a better fit. And thus, it makes the Grizzlies better. But I think right now, as Grizzlies fans, our hopes are based on Zach Edey being useful or good, and then internal improvement. And for me, I don't consider internal improvement part of the offseason grade. And that's one reason why I haven't been that excited about any offseason for the past few seasons. Because when I look at the 2022 team, the 2021-22 team, the team that beat the Timberwolves, the team that made it to the second round against the Warriors, the team that won 56 games in the regular season, when I look at that team and I look at the players who have changed out from that team, you know, we've spoken a lot about it. We've spoken about the triple down on youth summer. We talked about how they tried to veer away from that last year by trading for Marcus Smart. When I still look at the turnover on the roster, not counting the players that are still here, like Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, and Jaren Jackson Jr. are, of course, better now than they were then. But when I look at all the other players, it's still a question mark if we've improved around those guys. Is Marcus Smart and Zach Edey better overall than Dylan Brooks and Steven Adams and Tyus Jones? That's not even counting my guys Kyle Anderson and DeAnthony Melton. I still feel like the overall talent of the roster hasn't matched up to what it was a few seasons ago. I also think it's interesting when you consider the trades that the team has made. Like they moved on from Steven Adams last year. I think it was a fine move. You had to, I think, pick a direction, and you also kind of had to, I think, move on from the injury concerns. We are in win now mode. That's another standard that I use to judge the offseason. I think I weigh much more heavily the moves that we made to win this season. I think where we are in the competitive cycle, when we look at the fact that Ja Morant and Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. are all in the primes of their careers, they are all on lucrative extensions off of their rookie deals, we are now paying salary for a contender. Thus, I weigh the moves that make us better this year or next year much more heavily than any long-term sustainable success type moves. Like cycling in Cam Spencer to eventually be a cheap replacement for Luke Kennard. Okay, I understand why you might think that's a good thing to grade the Grizzlies on for this offseason, but it's not going to help them win a title this year or next year, I don't think. Maybe age 25 Cam Spencer next year, going to be unreal. But I weigh more heavily the moves that you made to make the team competitive this year. And I think they really fell down on that. And that's what brings me back to those trades you make. Like for Steven Adams, you had to make a decision because he wasn't going to be healthy or you were unsure about his health. Reminder, the things that we got for Steven Adams, we got 3 second-round picks and, of course, a traded player exception that I would say odds are we will never use. The 3 second-round picks that we got for Steven Adams, we've already used 2 of them, if you were unsure. We used them on Jalen Wells and Cam Spencer. The 2 second-round picks we got for Xavier Tillman. No issue with trading away Xavier Tillman. It's the right thing to do. He was going into free agency. Get something for him. He's a replaceable player. You can find someone on the minimum to be a big, I believe, at the same level of Xavier Tillman. The 2 second-round picks that we got for Xavier Tillman, well, we used one of them to salary dump Zaire. As far as the other one, I'm actually unclear about this. I'm looking at the Basketball Reference transaction logs. I was also looking at the Real GM future picks owed. I'm not certain if we still have that pick either. We might have used it to move from 57 to 55 or whatever we did to trade with the Timberwolves to move up and get Cam Spencer. It's possible we trade away that pick there. So even when you look at the roster sustainability moves we made at last year's trade deadline, which was unloading Xavier Tillman and it was moving on from Steven Adams, we've actually used most of the things we got for that on this year's roster, on bringing in rookies. And so, I mean, I guess you could call that like a C+ if you're super excited about that. For me, I'm like, best case scenario, that's fine. And so like that kind of hovers around like a C grade. And then of course, when you go back to the luxury tax issue, which I'm beating a dead horse here, I don't know what kind of grade you would give dodging the luxury tax just for dodging the luxury tax. Like I said, we didn't do some kind of sneaky move where we picked up talent or an asset to shed salary. No, we paid to shed salary. For me, that's like a D. That is what it is. And that's all they did this offseason. Could you persuade me to make it a D+? Yeah, sure. I could probably go D+. I mean, even if you feel like the draft picks should be a bigger part of the grade, let's say you give the Grizzlies an A+ for drafting Zach Edey and Jalen Wells and Cam Spencer. I mean, I still don't know how much that should sway anything. One, we're not going to know if they're good picks for a while. I mean, maybe we'll know immediately. Like Zach Edey, maybe he wins Rookie of the Month every single month in the Western Conference this year. But like, even when I look at the draft and giving a team a good grade for the draft, they took guys who were projected to be available for them. So I don't know how much you really can boost up the grade. Maybe that's not fair. And also this goes to me not knowing much about the draft. Just me not knowing the prospects. Am I supposed to base an offseason grade on Summer League based on the things I saw? That doesn't make much sense to me. For me, I'm basing it on what avenues were available to you. What did you do? What players did you add that weren't here the previous year? How did you replace the loss of Steven Adams? And for me, it's all kind of up in the air still. And who's going to be the Brandon Clark emergency replacement if Brandon Clark's not good to go? How do this team set themselves up to compete for the Western Conference title? It's still a mystery. And maybe the offseason grade changes or the overall roster move grade, which is something different, because they are set up to make a move if they need to. They want to perhaps see what it looks like with a healthy Ja, Des Jaren, and Marcus Smart. They want to see what it looks like with Zach Edey, and then they can make a move in the regular season. So they didn't back themselves into a corner by any means. They can still do things, but if we just look at the moves they made this offseason and how the talent level changed from last year's projected healthy squad to this year's projected healthy squad, and important caveat that I use, if you throw out internal development, I can't get that excited about the offseason. So for me, that's a D, but of course, I'm sure many of you will disagree. Anyways, Thanks, you guys, for listening. I enjoy talking about the Grizzlies. I am happy you guys enjoy listening to me do it. If you want to get more of me talking about the NBA and the Grizzlies, join over at patreon.com/fastbreakbreakfast. If you're already a Patreon supporter, and again, you want to play fantasy football, the draft is going to be August 29th. The sign up is up right now at patreon.com/fastbreakbreakfast. And with that, hope you guys have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. Go Grizz.